So we should be able to see it now, right? You can see my cool little slide here.
Looks great.
Awesome, cool. So let's go ahead and get going, shall we? So today's talk, functional testing, a new era of pen testing. And I want you to, as we go through this talk, because it's going to be a lot of interesting data points, a lot of interesting information, is we're going to be discussing essentially like how we can use a new format of pen testing to essentially solve problems that are real. And we're going to be using data points that I pulled from about the past, I want to say about the past 8 months or so, and show that there's serious problems out there and folks are worried about the cloud, yet we still have to deploy the cloud. So we're more focused on its usability, its deployments, than we are with its security. So this talk is talking about how we can essentially use offensive security and dub it functional testing instead of pen testing or offensive security. We dub it functional testing. It's a little bit more PC, and use that as a way to actually properly assess, evaluate the cloud, and build security within our cloud deployments. So let's go ahead and get going. So it wouldn't be a talk without the presenter talking about himself, or their self rather. And so, you know, you're gonna see a lot of stuff up here, and a lot of times anytime I present, I always present my who am I slide, and a lot of folks say, John, how the hell do you do all this? So if you have any questions about that, about time management, please feel free to ask me offline after the talk. But to give myself in a nutshell, I'm a feral security dude. So what does that mean? I'm essentially a freelancer. I paved my own way. I started doing that a couple months ago, just for various reasons. So right now what I do is I do a lot of freelance pen testing and a lot of freelance bug bounty hunting. And then I'm also an author. I'm the author of AWS Penetration Testing, a beginner's guide to pen testing AWS. I'm also helping co-author a book right now with a couple friends about how to get into cybersecurity and a lot of different things about what you can do. I'm also a content creator. I do content creation as a contractor for CompTIA and potentially some other large vendors coming down the line. I'm doing talks with them right now. I'm also a podcaster. I am the founder of Offensive Security Interviews, which is a podcast that essentially allows folks who are not into security but are trying to get into security, be on the show and talk about themselves, talk about what they know, and kind of do like an interview. So if you're interested in doing that, please let me know. Hit me up after the talk, and we'll definitely get you set to get you on the show. And then we also, interview folks that have been in the field and talk about their lessons learned about what folks should be trying to do or what they should be focusing on if they want to get into that area that that interviewee is in. I'm also on the Hackers and Hexens podcast, where we interviewed lots of primarily a diverse amount of folks but primarily women, and basically show how women can build their own roadmaps to getting into security or succeeding in security. And then the big thing that I do is I'm a professor and an educator. I do teach as an adjunct at City U of Seattle, National University, Metro State University. I teach basic cybersecurity I teach anything from basic cybersecurity all the way to offensive security. And I'm also a volunteer for virtually testing. I do OSCP 10-week prep workshops for virtually testing. And I am now, as of this week, the Hack the Box ambassador for Seattle. So if you're interested in doing Hack the Box challenges, getting more acquainted with offensive security tactics, and just getting more involved in the community, feel free to find us on meetups.com and join the group. We also have a Discord too, so if you want to join, feel free to hit me up. And then, the big thing that I always like to say is I do have the OSCP. Instead of tried harder, I feel like I cried harder because it was 6 months of misery to get that certification. So enough about me, though. Let's go ahead and jump into what we're supposed to be talking about. Okay, so we need to settle a baseline before we start getting into the meat and potatoes, so to speak. Or for vegetarians, vegans out there, such as myself, the tofu and potatoes. So pen testing. What is pen testing? It's essentially a simulated attack that a group of professionals emulate on an organization to evaluate the overall security posture of those security systems, right? So think of it as essentially as an authorized hacking engagement to show companies where they're weak to allow them to be better, right? For those of you that have been in pen testing, you know this. For those of you that are looking to get into pen testing, this is what it's all about. It is really about evaluating an organization to make them better than they were before. So it's not all about the hacking, but the hacking plays a big part, right? So, but the main objective is to evaluate the systems. So when we really think about it, it is a technical engagement, but it's really plays a big part into the people and the processes of the systems that you're evaluating, right? So what I mean by that is that if you're a technical person, you're a pen tester, you're hands-on keyboard, in the zone and everything, you need to be able to execute that skill set properly, but you also need to be able to bring your head up off the keyboard and look at your client and be able to concisely and professionally detail what you're finding and how they can fix it. We do that in the form of, verbal comments or written comments, and then also in reports. And also, really big thing is in relationships, right? So it's about those people and processes, and know that your technical skills are going to play a major role. That's why you have to continuously keep up with it on things like Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, getting certifications that are hands-on rather than not hands-on. Such as like, the OSCP or the ECPPT, things like that, right? Those are going to be those hands-on certifications that are going to evaluate and search your knowledge technically. But you also have to have those soft skills to be able to be a professional, keyword is professional, pen tester. You have to be able to establish that relationship with these folks that you're going to be working with and ensure that they understand what you're doing and how they can fix it. And it's your job to also ensure that you maintain that relationship while they're fixing whatever you found, right? So you have to concurrently be able to walk the walk and talk the talk. Cool. So now we should have at least for this presentation, we should understand in the context what pen testing is and how we utilize it to make an organization better. And remember that we use it to make an organization better, not just to be like, okay, cool, I can hack a company for a living, and that's going to be my job. Now we're going to pivot. We're going to start pivoting into cloud, okay? So as you can see, these are the three big cloud service providers. We're going to kind of make quick mentions of others, but these are the big ones that we always like to talk about. Interestingly enough, Microsoft established a big contract with the Army this week. I was reading about that this morning. So it's interesting that they are still establishing themselves into the DoD market. However, as we can see, AWS, they are the majority of the market shareholder. And what that means is that most companies go to AWS, right? If you work, for those of you that work in major enterprises, I'm sure you've experienced AWS, or you know someone in your organization that manages AWS. 8 times out of 10, you're going to interact with AWS inside of an organization. Microsoft Azure, though, they are in major enterprises. A lot of times you'll see companies use multi-cloud infrastructure, and what that means is that they're using more than just one cloud provider to do what they need to do. And there's various reasons. We're not going to really talk about those reasons, but do know that that is something that organizations do because it's going to help them solve the problems that they're trying to solve. But the DoD is the major client for the DoD. The DoD does use AWS as well, but Azure is the primary factor there. And then we have GCP. I said familiar service. What does that mean? Well, GCP is ran by Google, right? The Google Cloud Platform. Most of us have a Gmail account. A lot of us have probably interacted with G Suite, right? Where we, especially in like smaller enterprises or small companies, they typically, in my experience, use G Suite. And so when you're using G Suite, you naturally just kind of like go into GCP. So it's a familiar service. that folks that are using G Suite like to use. So these are the big Goliaths in the cloud arena, so to speak. And as we can see, this is a report pulled from August 2020. So we're going at right about 8 months there, right? And this is some of the more recent data that I can find. We have AWS up there at the top, right? They're the leaders, and they're kind of like, if you look at it, leaders and visionaries, right? They are setting the pace. These folks are putting out new services all the time. They're constantly doing a lot of different things to help push the envelope in the way how we look at cloud computing. Then we have Microsoft and Google right on the tail of AWS, right? And then we have these little niche players, IBM, Oracle, Alibaba, and others that are not trying to replicate what AWS, Microsoft, and Google are doing, but they are a niche player, meaning that they are doing their own thing. So they have the potential to become a leader. Especially think about it right now with the constant security issues we're seeing in cloud security. If breaches keep occurring with Amazon or Azure or GCP, one of those three leaders, if it continuously occurs and the cadence is frequent, it allows for these niche players to actually go into that leadership box. And before you know it, one of these other leaders might actually fall back. And it's good to know that, because as we go through the talk, there's a lot of variance and buffer for that to happen because of these security issues. And then this is always like a slide that I like to put in there just for money and quantitative reasons, right? We see that the cloud is becoming a $100 billion market. That's pretty crazy, right? And so a lot of folks are using it. A lot of folks are using it. And notice how Amazon Web Services, aka AWS, is the primary shareholder there. So just know that, and know that as we go forward with the cloud, and knowing that it's generating all this revenue, it's probably just going to generate more, right? That's what I would think. That's a good assumption. I would hope that most of us can assume that, based on this data, that it's just going to keep trickling up, right? Not down, but up. It just depends on which organization gets the most of the money bucket. All right. So now that we know about cloud, we know about pen testing, we know a little bit about where these organizations are going. Now let's start talking about cloud breaches, right? We understand that pen testing can help evaluate systems before a cloud breach, just a breach happens, and in this case, the cloud, right? And now we understand who these big targets could be. Remember, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So now let's talk about okay, well, cool, they're these big head honchos, but what's the security issues? Okay, well, let's talk about that. Misconfigurations maintain as the largest issue. Okay, continues to rise in the cloud market, or continuous rise in the cloud market does not match the upkeep for training staff on the cloud. And I mentioned that before we pop the slides up here, right? We're seeing this large gap where usability and continuous deployments are being focused on more than the security issues. And when you think about it, for those of us that have been in the industry for a little bit, we understand that that's kind of like an archaic way of thinking, right? Where you say usability over security, or maybe it's not an archaic way, right? Maybe that's just kind of the way how things happen, and we're seeing it just more in the cloud because everybody's going to the cloud. But what's the why, right? And you'll see here, right? You should see my mouse. You'll see the what's going on, and the why. Okay. So lack of training in security groups and security controls within cloud services. It's not symmetrical to go from physical security controls to cloud security controls. And the way how they're implemented is not symmetrical. It's not same at all. And especially when you're going to different cloud providers, the way how you secure Azure is not the same way how you secure Alibaba or AWS or anything like that. You have to learn a new skill set on how you actually implement those controls. And that's what's causing a lot of these misconfigurations. Okay. So Another big thing, keys left in open repos or repositories. AWS keys are a big hit. All right. So for those of you that don't know, essentially an AWS key is essentially like, think of it as like the username and password or the SSH key to get into a cloud environment, right? So you set up a virtual cloud environment inside AWS, and those keys are essentially keys to that environment. But when as developers and security engineers, a lot of times we'll share those keys in like GitHub or GitLab or something like that. And unfortunately, if that GitHub or GitLab repo becomes compromised, then those keys become compromised, and then that cloud environment becomes compromised. So it's got this interesting chain effect that makes it basically into a giant snowball that nobody wants to deal with. And what's the why to that? Well, lack of understanding on how to use cloud secrets. Right? We shouldn't be just leaving them up in these open repositories that we may or may not understand. Okay? And then the third one, the what to number 3. Many companies are moving to the cloud. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and all of us having to work remote or, doing a remote conference, such as right now, this is New Jersey and I'm actually based out of Washington. A lot of us are working remote or doing things remote. And the pandemic has also caused a lot of budget cuts. It's forced a lot of companies to cut budgets rather than people. So they have to find a way to make the money work for them, or the money that they're losing, make that new budget work for them. And a lot of times it's easier for them to sell off their physical infrastructure and just go to the cloud, because a lot of times, with the cloud, those services are a lot of the times just billed as you're using it, right? Rather than having to go and buy hundreds of thousands of dollars of hardware, you can just throw it into the cloud and you're only getting billed while you're using it or while it's up. And when it's down or you're not using it, you're not getting billed. Another thing, companies want to stay up to date. They want to be in the cool kid crowd, right? If your competitor is using cloud services, you want to do it too. Because otherwise you're going to think, okay, well, we might fall behind the curve here. And then scale. A lot of us working in security have seen an uptick in working since the pandemic. And a lot of that coincides with scaling our environments, and the cloud allows us to do that, right? If we need to bring up infrastructure, we can do it in less than a day with the cloud, versus with hardware, you would have to have a technician on site and configure it, and then possibly have to remote into it later and configure it some more and do a bunch of other stuff, right? There's a lot of different pieces there, a lot of different steps. With the cloud, you just say, okay, cool, a couple buttons are clicked, you set some policies, you got infrastructure up like that. So, but why are we getting breaches from that? Well, we're moving faster than we can keep up with the education for educating the professionals and the engineers and analysts, whoever that's bringing up this infrastructure. So, again, as you can see, a lot of we're moving too quickly and we're not training folks, right? It's pretty much that simple. So, interesting data point here. 79% of companies that participated in a particular survey of over 300 participants, again, that's 300 participants, and mind you, they were all chief information security officers. So 300 CISOs participated in a certain survey, and nearly 80% of them had reported that they had a breach within 18 months. That's crazy, right? Go back to the last slide, and we realize that everybody's trying to go to the cloud, and now CISOs are being like, okay, well, every year and a half we're getting a breach. At least 8 out of every 10, right? And then 43% of them, right? So think about that as like 4.5, or maybe even round up, let's say 5. Say they're suffering 10 breaches every year and a half. That's almost a breach every 2 months, or every month and a half. Every month and a half, yeah. What? So this isn't okay, right? This is not okay. We can't act like this is okay, because it's not. So chief information security officers, think of them as the buffer between the security teams and the executive board. Imagine you owning a company, a large company, and the CISO says, okay, well, we've suffered 10 breaches in the past year and a half from our new cloud infrastructure. Do you want to put up some more? As a leader or an executive, you would probably say, no, absolutely not, right? But then you also would have, other executives in tech say, well, we got to do it because that's what everybody else is doing, or it saves money, or whatever those other reasons to the what that we just talked about, right? So this is where we need to start formulating our own plans about, okay, how can we solve the problem of deploying cloud while also securing the cloud and not becoming a statistic, such as what we're seeing here. 91% of organizations are concerned about their cloud security. So that means the CISO that's going to the board, those board members are saying, well, crap, this isn't good. This doesn't seem good, folks. What are we doing, right? So that means, think about it in large scale companies. That means 9 out of every 10 companies, the board, the directors, whoever is there, people that are working in higher leadership are really worried. They're really, really worried, and yet here we are still going to the cloud. So that was some interesting data points to throw at you. I know I've presented this talk a couple other times, and a lot of folks have been concerned about it, and I can give you the resources of where I got all this data, but at the end of the day, those are two very alarming things, right? So now that we understand the concerns, what's causing some of the confusion at the granular level, right? And I don't always like sharing this because it's a pretty fundamental thing, but I feel like it's a good thing to share because we need to understand where we get lost in translation here. And if you look at the infrastructure as a service, this is the primary thing where we get confused at, because this is where a lot of these issues are happening. Because as you can see, the cloud provider has less responsibility and the consumer has more responsibility. As opposed to software as a service, it's primarily occupied by the cloud provider, and the customer has very little interaction or very little response. However, when we bring on cloud infrastructure, a lot of times these 3 different things here get confused, okay? But look at that infrastructure as a service. Okay, big thing, physical, right? We don't have physical access to this stuff anymore. So we think, okay, we don't have to worry about it, which guess what, guys? We don't. That's not our problem, folks, not at all. However, the way how we set up user access is 100% our responsibility. And if an issue occurs, it becomes our fault. If you want more information on how that occurs and how it is our fault and our problem, definitely look up use cases for the Capital One breach. It's been the breach of many different talks. But if you go and you actually look up some use cases and find more root cause analysis on the problems, you're gonna see that it's really just a big issue with user access, and that trickles down to a lot of other cloud breaches. For quick fun insight, Facebook has actually suffered from breaches because of user access issues in the cloud. So is the DoD. 3-letter organizations have. It's all these user access issues. So now that we understand some of the underlying potential issues, right, with user access and the confusion between like what we're responsible for, we need to understand what some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, aka TTPs, are that threat actors are using, whether they be an insider threat or an external threat or anything in between. So 45% of these folks that are attacking our infrastructure, and in this case our cloud infrastructure, are actually using hacking techniques. Okay, so that's the typical way of how we see breaches happen, right? That with like insider threats. However, if you look where that other arrow is pointing, I like to always point this out, is 8% of breaches were misused by authorized users. So misuse can be intentional or unintentional. I want to advise that. But what that means is that if someone accidentally breaks something by accident, and essentially that means that's our fault as the engineers, the analysts, the security professionals that are maintaining, deploying, and monitoring the cloud infrastructure. We should ensure that our systems aren't being misused by accident by our users and then getting broken. Right? We don't want that to happen, but we're seeing it happen quite a bit. Misuse and misaction is a very, very common occurrence in cloud breaches or just cloud security issues, right? And a security issue doesn't always necessarily mean a breach, but it can mean systems can go down or it can affect the usability of that cloud service. Okay, so now that we understand a lot, we've talked about pen testing, we've talked about the cloud providers, we've talked about data, our security concerns, and now we've talked about some of the underlying issues and all that good stuff. Now we need to talk about, okay, so how do we fix this? Well, we could pen test it, right? A lot of folks thought that might be the way to go. However, this, as you can see, says 85% confirm that legacy security solutions don't work in AWS. And while this is geared towards AWS, know that this can really blanket on most cloud providers. Just to let you know, just to be advised, it works on most cloud providers. So 85% of security solutions aren't working on AWS or other cloud providers, or they have very limited functionality. And as you can see, 60% of the tools and processes and procedures that we're using don't work. They don't work. 23% don't work. Or I'm sorry, 23% don't work, 62% have limited functionality, which means we're not going to be able to see all of it, right? And then 15% work, okay? 15%. That's like saying like Nmap probably works. But a lot of the other tools don't. A lot of the other frameworks don't work, right? And you need to understand that that 62%, that's not just limited to tooling. It's also frameworks and the way how we assess and build controls within cloud environments. So how do we fix it? Well, the first question is, can we? I think that's a pretty good question to ask, right? Maybe, hopeful, but we have to start rethinking the way of how we do it. So now we're going to go into the more transitioning part of the talk where we talk about pen testing and start getting into pen testing the cloud. So pen testing in a general sense, right, typically looks for vulnerabilities in software, networks, apps, system vulnerabilities, all that jazz, right? And we use a bunch of different tools. So now it's going to be going up against functional testing, okay? Functional testing is pen testing, but it adds some cloud flair, right? We incorporate those standard pen testing tactics, but we add a little bit of spice to it, a little bit of cloud spice, okay? So it looks for those systematic vulnerabilities in the cloud, and it's going to be proprietary to those cloud providers. You can't evaluate systematic vulnerabilities on Azure the same way you would in AWS or Alibaba, IBM, rinse, lather, repeat, you understand. We analyze and evaluate security postures from a QA perspective. That's going to be a key word, folks, that I want you to remember. QA perspective. We kind of have to take off our hacker hat here and just kind of put on our QA hat and give it a little bit of offensive security flavoring. Okay? And we need to understand that security is typically built into these services that we're deploying in the cloud. Okay? The companies that we are contracting with for cloud services and cloud deployments spend millions and millions or billions of dollars making sure that their product is secure. But how much are we investing in ourselves to ensure that we aren't messing that up? Okay? And then just a quick little bullet point. 77% of cloud breaches involved breach credentials. So remember those open GitHub repos or misuse of authorized systems. All right, so we should probably think, before we pen test, we should have credentials to the cloud application, not to the applications on the services, but to the cloud itself, right? So like think about it as in the AWS Management Console. You're going to need access to that. You're going to need access to the Azure Management Console, to wherever everything's being managed. You need access to that as a security professional that's going to be assessing these organizations. We're going to have to kind of, unfortunately, but fortunately, throw out that black box playbook and reconstruct the way how we assess the cloud. Okay, so forms of cloud pen testing. And you can take this and you can mix this all together. It doesn't have to be singular. You can really mix all of this information together to build a framework to assess the cloud. Okay, so we have testing within the cloud. That validates the internal features of the cloud system. So that's like going into the cloud management console. Okay, it's executed from an internal perspective. And this should be the most popular. It often is, but it should be. So for those of you that work for a security organization that might assess various organizations as your client, you need to understand that internal pen testing is going to give your client the biggest bang for their buck, okay? And so that means that you're going to need to assess the applications on the services, but also go and look at those security controls and those groups that are based around the services. Do the services have DoD, or not DoD, do they have DOS protection, right? That's something that gets built into services, and you can turn it off. So you need to start thinking about, okay, we're going to assess the application on the services, but we're also going to assess the services themselves. And you don't have to have a bunch of tooling to do that. You can use some simple auditing scripts as well as just going through it manually. Depending on the size, it could take a long time, so it's better to use some simple audit tools, but you don't have to have all these like offensive security tactics to do it. You can incorporate that into the applications on the services, but not so much with the services themselves. Testing across clouds, right? That means we're looking at different vendors. We're also looking at hybrid public-private cloud infrastructure. You don't want your public cloud infrastructure to talk to your private infrastructure, so you need to be able to assess that. Or you might not want somebody to be able to look at your private cloud infrastructure, okay? And you can incorporate different pen testing methodologies into this as well, right? With public, you might be able to do a little bit more of a black box test because it's something out there on the open, and you want to assess what someone who has no idea what the services are under the application, you can have them assess it from a outsider perspective. However, you also want to have that internal perspective and be able to go into the management console and ensure that there's nothing within the service that's misconfigured, okay? And then we have our Sas testing, right? Performs functional and non-functional testing against a predefined requirement. Think of that as kind of like an audit, essentially. You have a checklist and you're going through it. And for those of you that do pen test professionally, I'm sure you see that we do go through checklists, right? But you can't go through like the OWASP top 10 checklist for this stuff. You have to have a proprietary checklist towards that cloud service on what to do. You can't just kind of willy-nilly it, so to speak, okay? Some other things that we can incorporate into our functional, remember functional is cloud pen testing essentially, into our functional testing. We can do system verification testing. This is a very QA kind of thing. This is a lot of times used in software development. It ensures the systems behave the way they're intended to. And it ensures the modules in the cloud systems interact with each other in a way that they're supposed to. The key point there is that you want to ensure that they act the way they're supposed to and not act a way that they are not supposed to, because if they do, that creates variance where a breach could happen. Acceptance testing, right? We test these cloud-based applications. Okay, we make sure that they work in the way how they're supposed to. This often refers, again, to a checklist. Especially if there's an application on the cloud service. Think about it as like if you built a web server on an EC2 instance, you would want to make sure that that web application interacts with the service the way it's supposed to, vice versa, and ensure that that application interacts with the users in the way it's supposed to. All right. Other types of testing that we can incorporate into this, big functional pen testing kind of thing, right? There's a lot here, right? So we have interoperability testing. Interoperability testing. Big word, right? For our Saturday afternoon. Ensures applications work on this the same on other platforms. This is really big. If you develop an application such as a web server or a web application or a piece of software, and you throw it onto a service within the cloud, such as AWS, you want to ensure that it also works on Azure the same way, because it might not. So it's good to ensure that if you're running multi-hybrid cloud environments with various different cloud vendors, you want to ensure that that application works same on both vendors, or all vendors that you're using. And a big reason is why is because if you are using, say we're using AWS and Azure, and we build a web app and we throw it onto AWS, and then before you know it, your CISO says, okay, we're tired of AWS, we're just going to go with Azure, and you throw it onto Azure, but you didn't test it on Azure, you might actually open up a hole. So it's good to know that we make sure that whatever we're developing, we test it on all different cloud vendors. Availability testing, right? We're essentially testing the availability of the cloud service. And that's where you're going to be looking at the cloud services that you're deploying at the console management level, right? And when you start getting into that kind of pen testing, it's good to refer to the service level agreement about pen testing the provider, because they may have some do's or don'ts, right? For example, if you want to test for DOS protection, you can't necessarily test it, right? You have to get written consent. That's typically unauthorized from a cloud provider. Multi-user testing, we're testing cloud applications with various users. So we're essentially saying we're wanting to check and ensure that, a janitor can't accidentally do privilege escalation through misuse. Remember that 8% of misuse, that a janitor can't get access to admin rights. It's as simple as that. Performance testing, test the performance of the cloud. Think of that as like, okay, how much bandwidth can this thing take? Or how much can it hold? Send multiple requests at once, right? Again, a lot of that can sometimes seep into DOS. So you need to make sure that you have an agreement between you and the cloud provider, or an exception that allows you to do that, right? Don't just go start firing off millions of packets willy-nilly, seeing if you can bring it down, because that can turn into a lawsuit. And then standard security testing, right? Ensures the security of the data within the cloud. Okay, so we have a lot of these different things that we can do. But what are the things that we really need to consider? Cloud environments come in different flavors. We have public, private, and hybrid clouds. Hybrid can be a combination of public, private, multi-vendor, all sorts of stuff. That's where it starts to get really complicated. It's important that if you do that, you educate your users and your engineers, your analysts, whoever is deploying and securing all this stuff, that they're up to speed on what you're supposed to be doing. And you can do that through internal education, or doing vendor certifications, whatever it is that you feel is the best bet for your organization is the way you should go. But the worst thing that you can do is nothing. Okay? So ensure that you're training your professionals the way how they should be trained. And ensure that scope is thorough, right? Preliminary requirements need to be laid out and understood by all. That goes, and that's not just with pen testing or functional testing. That includes bringing on the cloud provider. You need to check the SLA between you and the cloud provider to ensure that everything is kosher, essentially. Everything is concise, everything is up to par, and meets the expectations of what the agreement is going to be. And then you can start building out pen testing frameworks and security frameworks around that, start training your company on that, ensuring that security by design is not an afterthought and it's actually built in. Okay? So this is pretty much an accurate representation sometimes of how the cloud is. So how can we move forward, though? Well, if we think back, right, 85% of the stuff that we're doing just doesn't work well anymore, or it's not working at all. And yet here we are, a lot of the times, still doing it. So to quote the infamous Albert Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Starting to look at all of us, folks. We can't do the same thing that we've been doing and expect better results. If anything, the different results are typically not playing in our favor. Okay? And then we wind up being that gentleman with the hat and the straitjacket saying, we're not crazy. Why are you looking at us? We're not crazy. So moving forward, we got to start thinking outside the box a little bit here. All right? We need to understand the different cloud providers that we're bringing on. We can't just be under the assumption or give us this fantasizing facade that we know it because we're security professionals. Okay? Got to kind of drop our ego a little bit here. So we need to understand that cloud services require new skill sets. As I mentioned, GCP, that Google Cloud provider, we've all used Gmail, and a lot of us have used G Suite. So a lot of times, it's going to it is, kind of that facade that we're like, oh, we're going to know how to use this, when it's not necessarily true. So we'll go into GCP and be like, all right, we're not going to learn anything about anything. We're just going to start using it. Don't do that. Okay. And then AWS. AWS is the steepest learning curve. You have to learn a completely new skill set to understand AWS. And that's not to say that you don't have to do it with the other ones, but you're more likely to interact with AWS than you are with the niche players, right? Okay. So how do we start reformulating that? So let's really think about that. And for us in offensive security, this kind of means we need to give up the helm a little bit. We need to allow someone else to take the wheel for a little bit and steer the ship, because we didn't always do a good job. So we need to start thinking about, maybe we can start training cloud security engineers, right? Is it easier to teach a scientist how to fly a spaceship, or a pilot how to do, general science? What's going to solve the problem to put, a group of folks in a spaceship and send them into space to do whatever they need to do? Well, it's the same kind of concept here. We need to solve this cloud security issue. So do we keep throwing things at offensive security professionals? Or do we take these individuals that are already knowledgeable in cloud security and teach them the offensive tactics? Essentially, we embed that threat mindset into them so that they understand when they're introducing something into a cloud system, they understand the cause and effect that could possibly occur. So we teach these cloud security engineers functional testing, pen testing, and offensive security tactics at a general level. Because remember, we don't need to use 85% of the crap that we've been doing. So maybe they have some good ideas. Maybe a lot of great ideas will spawn out of that. Who knows? But it's worth a try. And then the big thing, this goes for all of us for working as security professionals, or even non-security professionals. If you're a student, take this in and carry on the knowledge as you go forth. Or if you're not a security engineer, but you work in IT, or you work in software dev, or wherever you are, understand that this can apply to the same. It applies the same, right? So we need to integrate that security awareness, right? Security by design needs to be integrated in the process, in the framework, not as an afterthought. So how do we do that? We educate ourselves and others first. Taking the information that I just illustrated to all of you, you can educate others by demonstrating that same information in whatever way you feel fits best for your eye. Then you need to find ways to evaluate the folks that you're educating. Especially in a business, there's easy ways to do this. You can do surveys, or you can build up test environments, right? Spinning up a test environment in the cloud and spending $1,000 or a couple $1,000s on a test environment to evaluate folks' knowledge is better than having to suffer from a multi-million-dollar breach. Okay, so we evaluate our folks, and then we allow them to deploy stuff. Then we allow them to build, create, deploy, and then we make sure that we have proper monitoring and evaluation on the cloud operations, the infrastructure, as well as the culture, right? And that's not saying like, okay, here's a thing that says you can't do this, don't click on links. It's more than that. It's teaching folks about how to maintain the cloud infrastructure as new services start to come up, right? Because especially like AWS, they're coming out with new services all the time. So how do you ensure that the culture of your organization understands that this is an evolving thing? You can't rely on what you know. You have to be in a continuous researcher mode to ensure that you're seeking knowledge for what you don't know. So that's my talk. I really, really appreciate the JerseyCTF and all the folks here for allowing me to be here, and also for all of you taking time out of your Saturday afternoon to come and talk or listen to me. If you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn at my name, John Helmus. Moosey Moose at Twitter. I'm also on Medium. I haven't wrote there in a while, but some folks like to read the archives of the stuff that I have written over the years. I'm also on Discord under Moosey, and you can also find me at these links on my on the 2 podcasts that I'm on. So that's all I have for you folks. Again, round of applause for all of you for being here. I hope this was insightful, and that you can take this knowledge and use it to make the world a better place as we go through the technology era that we're in, and especially as we start to push cloud infrastructure into the technology era that we're in. So now I'm here for Q&A or anything in between.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate all the information. That's wonderful, and I'm really happy for to have had you on our platform here. So please, everybody, feel free to reach out to him on any of those handles. John's very nice to talk to. Obviously, so yeah. As promised, I will provide a flag to everybody for participating. Thank you so much for supporting our speaker. And then afterwards, we could probably have 2 to 3 minutes of Q&A if anybody wants to drop their questions. So actually, John, feel free to start. Would you like for me to read them to you?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. So anybody, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A or Tech Talk, and I will make sure to read those out. I see. Okay. So someone earlier said, what are your time management skills? I guess for time management, and also maybe related to security somehow?
Yeah, no, I mean, we can relate it to life, and security is kind of life sometimes, or work is life. That's a great question though. It's really about just sticking to a schedule. You have to stick to the schedule that you set, but we also need to make sure that we use tools to basically automate a little bit of our life. And so what I do is I use a reminder daily task app that I can use to monitor my progress throughout the week of the tasks that I'm needing to do. It's called Todoist. That's TODOIST. It's an amazing thing, application that essentially, think about it as it takes your life and turns it into like a Kanban board. And it tells you progress on your week, tells you how you're doing, what you might have missed, and things like that. And essentially, I use that as a coach for myself. The other thing is and this sounds silly, but waking up with a purpose. And I've been in technology in engineering for over 10, 12 years now. And it's taken a long time to get to the point where, what's most important to me. And, I just essentially live a full life. I make sure that I live every day, going to bed at night saying I had a good day, or I did something good with my day that day. And making sure too that I take time out of my week to do things that might seem frivolous, like sitting down and reading a book or just going outside. It's essentially that. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's that simple. It's creating something that can coach you throughout your week and setting on goals that you set for yourself, but also understanding that you're human and that you need to take breaks throughout the week, right? The brain is a muscle, and you just can't go to the gym 24/7, pump iron and get swole, right? You got to take a break and allow your muscles to rest to actually give you that growth. It's the same thing with your brain. If you're hammering out for 12 hours a day, take the rest of the day off and do what you need to do. And also ensure that you take a day off throughout the week that doesn't focus on computer stuff. I know that's difficult sometimes, but yeah. So find applications, tools, and resources that are going to help you maintain a schedule that you set for yourself. Start off small and then go big, right? You don't just lift up the 100-pound dumbbells. You start out with the 25s or the 40s or whatever and work your way up to the hundreds. Work your way up to more complicated, bigger tasks. But start off small. That way you don't get long-winded right out the gate. Be kind to yourself, yeah, and also make sure that you make time for the little things, and you got to get used to it, but you find balance, and yeah, that's the best advice I can give.
I think that was one of the best answers that could have been given for those questions. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I think we're nearing out of time, but again, thank you so much for joining us. I think when I speak for all of the participants, we're very grateful that we were able to hear that talk from you. So thank you again.